Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the entire IHSA staff, welcome to this afternoon's Transfer Updates webinar. My name is Kurt Gibson, and I'm on the administrative staff here at IHSA. And I'll serve sort of as host and guide for today's webinar. In just a few moments, I will play for you a presentation that our Executive Director, Craig Anderson, recorded recently. Concerning specifically the new the Principals Concurrence Form, the new Principals Concurrence Form, how that, and the primary focus of the webinar will be on how that form needs to be completed. It'll give you some tips on making sure everything is done correctly, when it might be a time for you to submit for an eligibility request and things of that nature. So we hope you enjoy the presentation. There is a Attendee Chat feature, which you maybe have already discovered here on the site, and I would encourage you during the presentation, if you have questions, to type them in that area. I'll be monitoring those as they come and responding to those. When we get to the end of the presentation, I'll stick around and also maybe come back on and maybe answer some through writing, or just some like I did yesterday by just responding similar to the way I am right now. I would suggest or just point out, I was reminded yesterday that when you are in that attendee chat area, there's an opportunity to, should be right above where you're going to type in your question, you'll see something that says send to, and it may, in a default setting for you, say private to the presenter. I'd encourage you, unless it's something that is private, to make sure everybody can see the question. We were reminded of that yesterday when, in responding to some questions in writing, members of the audience were unsure what they were seeing there because they weren't aware of what the question that had been asked. So if you can remember to share, and we have some more questions about, well, what's this all about, I'll certainly fill in the context later on. But with that, again, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation. I'm going to go ahead and step away from the screen for a little bit. I'm going to bring in the presentation from Craig. It starts at about 30 seconds or so in. In the first 30 seconds, Craig is just welcoming you to the presentation. There's some audio glitches in that first 30 seconds, so we're going to move it ahead to where things are cleared up, and it really sort of dives right into the transfer eligibility process. Okay, so again, thanks. Enjoy the show, and we'll be back in just a few moments.
Hi, Todd.
Hello. The number of transfers, there's some things that we've come across. Those of you here with us today, along with some changes that we've made to the concurrence form, and a little bit about those changes and things to look out for as principals concurrence forms throughout the start of the school year so far this season. So with that, let's spend some time talking about just some suggestions about how schools should handle student transfers and residence and transfer eligibility. So that schools would devise a plan for acknowledging when, and in particular, there should be a designations that are generally responsible at schools to complete transfer paperwork. Obviously, from the IHSA office, it would be our recommendation that this individual would be a principal or an athletic or activity, but it could understand that it might be best suited for a guidance counselor or somebody who's going to work with new incoming. I would share, as we talk about the forms, in particular the new principals concurrence form that does have a component that has or requests some information from the family, that the school personnel completing the transfer paperwork be filling out the information, so they could ask questions and the school person could help summarize if there's a particular question about something that the family's being asked in regards to transfer. So first of all, it does need to be known that in order for a student that transfers into your school that's not an incoming freshman, it's a requirement of our bylaws that the principal's concurrence form be completed for any student that's going to participate in IHSA interscholastic competition. So while it may be best suited for some schools to fill out principal's concurrence forms for all students, that's probably the best way to take care of this. But without a doubt, in order for students to have eligibility to compete, at the very least, the principal's concurrence form must be completed by the receiving school, along with the Section 2 component that has the parent and athlete component, and then sent to the sending school to fill out their information where it's received and held at the receiving school until the student graduates or leaves the school. You'll see on this slide that I've also recommended that when filling out paperwork for transfer students relative to their participation, that additionally the transfer eligibility form would be completed as a result of gaining just additional information about the student and his or her transfer to your school that may then bring about information that may cause the school to say, yeah, we need an eligibility ruling from the IHSA before we grant this student the opportunity to participate. So those two forms at the very least, I would recommend having be completed, though per the bylaws, the only one that is required is the principal's concurrence form. So as mentioned, once a school has the concurrence form completed and it's been received from the sending school, at that point, then the receiving school needs to make a determination of whether or not to request an eligibility ruling from the IHSA office. And let me first start that it's never wrong for a school to send a request to the IHSA to request an eligibility ruling. That's the safest. While it's not required for every student that participates necessarily to have a ruling, it's a discretion of the school administrators. And if you're a new school administrator, it would be my recommendation, if you have a student participating and they're a transfer student, that you receive a ruling from the IHSA office just to be sure that the student's eligible to play. I would note a clean principal's concurrence form does not mean that the student is necessarily eligible. While the concurrence form is required, and it may come back that the sending school and the receiving school have no reservations, they concur with the transfer, there may be issues with the student's transfer that may require a ruling, and we'll try the concurrence. Again, if there's any question about a student's eligibility, I would strongly encourage schools to submit the eligibility transfer paperwork to the IHSA office and request an eligibility ruling. So when you've reached that decision that you're going to request an eligibility ruling for a particular student, here are the items that we need in the office to make an eligibility determination. At the very least, we're going to need a copy of the principal's concurrence form, again completed, a copy of the transfer eligibility form, along with the student's most up-to-date transcript. Depending upon the circumstances surrounding the student's transfer to your school, we may also need the residence eligibility form. So if there's any question about the residence or there's been a unique change in the residence of the student within your boundaries or within the area of which the student's attending maybe a private school, it may require the residence eligibility form. We may also require the affidavit of residence to be completed, along with a new form called the transfer component from the receiving school coach. So while it's not necessary all the time to send a copy of those forms, and if it is, one of those forms is going to be required for us to provide a ruling, the IHSA office will reach back out to the school and ask for the completion of that paperwork to be submitted to our office. When submitting a ruling, while I've indicated here the documents that must be sent to the office, if there's any other relevant information that would be beneficial for the IHSA office to know about the transfer, those could come in the form of a narrative from the family or documentation from the sending school or legal documents about a parent's divorce and or legal separation and who has been designated as a custodial parent would all be relevant information to send along with the original paperwork in order for the office to prepare a ruling. So again, if those are documents that we don't receive, though in order for us to provide a ruling we do need, we'll be reaching back out to the school and asking for that paperwork. So when it comes to transfer eligibility, the eligibility determination is going to be based upon the student and his or her families meeting the requirements of IHSA bylaws 3.03R in regards to residence and 3.04R in regards to transfer. And while we've produced webinars about residence and transfer, we're not going to spend a lot of time reviewing those two particular bylaws, but I would encourage new administrators at our member schools to become familiar with those bylaws so that they can help themselves about thinking through whether or not a student's eligibility determination will be required by submitting documents to the IHSA office. So familiarizing yourself with those two bylaws in particular would be helpful when thinking about sending for an eligibility ruling to our office. I would also add, based upon information as an administrator you may know about those two bylaws, you may immediately recognize that a particular student's not going to have eligibility for a particular sports season or over a particular period of time. I would always recommend, even with you knowing that's the case, I would recommend that you send to the IHSA office to secure a ruling, again, anticipating that the student may not have eligibility, but we will be able to identify a date at which the student will become eligible. And while the bylaws may indicate that the student would likely be ineligible up to a period of 365 days, many times the period of ineligibility could be less than that. For example, transfers to your school, a residence or transfer bylaw, and only played football in his previous school, the student may gain eligibility after the current football season as opposed to being ineligible for the entire school year. So there are circumstances where a period of ineligibility may be less than the 365 days that the bylaws may say that a student could be ineligible. Moving on to where you're going to locate these forms that you're going to complete and send to our office from our public side of our website, where you're seeing here our home page. If you put your cursor over the resources tab, a drop down will be available and you're going to select the download center. And once you select the download center, you're going to see the tabs that are here on the top. Immediately, the one that should be open and available is the Forms tab, which is where you're going to find all the eligibility forms that we've spoken to during this webinar. Obviously noted there inside the red box would be all of the possible eligibility forms that we may request of schools to fill out about students and their transfers. So that's the location of where you can find the forms. And now we're going to move into the new principals concurrence form and speak to some of the changes along with just some things I'd like to mention in regards to things we've seen as we've gone into using the new concurrence form. So the highlighted areas you're going to see as we talk through these slides are going to be areas that are brand new for the 17-18 school year. So this is just the heading of our concurrence form, and while we've talked previously, it's noted in this area that just because The student, again, may come back with a concurrence form. Again, that's what, quote, clean concurrence form does not mean the student is eligible. That you see in the first sentence there, when it says, when a student transfers to a member school from any other high school, the receiving school principal official representative must promptly complete and exchange this form with the principal official representative of the sending school. I would emphasize the must promptly complete is important, and that's why I would encourage, upon the entrance and registration of transfer students to your school, that the completion of this concurrence form be part of the registration process, because as quickly as possible, the quicker you can get this form completed, and if there's a question to the student's eligibility, submitted to our office for a ruling, can prevent some potential ineligibility simply because there hasn't been an exchange of forms. So they're encouraged as quickly as possible for this form to be put in place, to be completed, sent to the sending school for completion, and received by the receiving school. When we talk about rulings that are required from our office, and that's what's pointed out in this highlighted bullet, is that in particular questions on the form that we're going to see here in the next few slides, depending upon how those are marked by either the receiving school or the sending school, it's automatic that a ruling is going to be required by the IHSA office before the student's going to have any eligibility. So that's what the new information there is highlighting, those questions, depending upon how those are marked, where there is a requirement to submit for an eligibility ruling to the IHSA office. Section 1, as noted, is to be completed by the receiving school. I would emphasize in this area, while there's not a lot of new information to the form in regards to information that we're requesting, all parts of this section are extremely important for our office when requesting a ruling to be aware of. So the date that your school year began, the date of when the student actually began attending classes at your school are significantly important for us to render an eligibility ruling. So, and obviously knowing where the student came from as a sending school and your school is important, along with the other information that's asked here. So questions 9 and 10 allow the receiving school to make us, the IHSA, potentially aware of any bylaw violations that may result in the student being ineligible. And so the highlighted areas, again, note the new information that we're asking on this year's concurrence form, that we've offered up the opportunity to indicate that the student has transferred in a manner that is within the requirements of the eligibility rules found in our Constitution and bylaws, but there's some hesitation or reservation about giving that a full yes. So that's available now to the receiving school to make that indication on the principal's concurrence form. As we move on to section 2, you'll note in this area that we asked this to be completed by the transferring athlete and parent. And again, as I started the presentation, I would emphasize again now, while this is information that's going to come from the athlete and the parent, and as the administrator completing the form, you may turn the document to the parent and the athlete and let them complete, but it should be under the administrator's watch. There's going to be questions that the family or the student may not be aware of or may not understand, that the administrator may have to help explain. So obviously this is an area of which we're asking questions about any club team affiliations, along with asking about basic reasons for the transfer of schools. And there we're looking for, what are the circumstances surrounding the transfer coming from the parent and the athlete that necessitated the transfer. And this is the opportunity for both parent and athlete to share that information. I would note, simply because a particular AAU coach does have some form of affiliation with the receiving school, per our bylaws does not necessarily mean the student is ineligible. More documentation may need to be developed to determine if there's a possibility of ineligibility, but at least it's a start for us to understand the circumstances, potential circumstances surrounding the transfer. So again, you can see the questions, general in nature, are trying to figure out some basis for why the student has transferred. This is the second part of section 2, where the student and athlete are continuing to respond to questions. We've provided our definition of undue influence and what that means, trying to define that for the student, and then to ask some questions relevant to that. I'd bring particular attention as you're working through completing this form with the parent and the athlete, that questions number 20 and 21 are questioned to, as I'll read here, that they're answering this as they certify that they have not received any of the items listed above from the receiving school representative as inducement to transfer schools and participate in athletics at the school. So if they have not received any of those, then that should be marked yes. And the same is true for number 21. They're certifying that the student has not been contacted or recruited by any agent of the school, coach, or representative. And again, critical to make that point that they're answering that they have not received and have not been contacted or recruited by an agent of another school. The student and the parent or guardian representing the student are asked to sign and date this document of completion. This moves us to the last section, which is the section, once section 1 and section 2 are completed, is sent to the sending school to provide some information about their knowledge about the circumstances surrounding the transfer. So first of all, we ask that the sending school review both section 1 and section 2 and provide a response to whether or not they believe that's been completed correctly. Documentation about when the school year began, it can be critical for us to know. And then other questions here about a student's potential ineligibility that they've left. This could be academic ineligibility or a code of conduct violation. Obviously, these questions are important because bylaw 3.047 requires that any period of ineligibility that a student might have at a sending school follows that student to their receiving school. And this is where the sending school gets to offer that information. Additional questions are important. The participation of a student in a tryout, practice, or contest in a particular sport prior to transfer in question number 27. Extremely important for us when we're making an eligibility determination to know if that occurred. And then the last two questions are relative to, again, evidence or suspicion of recruiting. In question number 29, aware of any IHSA bylaw transfer, recruiting or transfer bylaws that may be violated that could result in a period of ineligibility. Now, I will add here, when we receive documentation from the sending school on a concurrence form that they've marked these things, that they do have evidence or suspicion of recruiting, or they are aware of a bylaw violation, while there may be a brief explanation here there, it's likely that the IHSA office is going to reach out to schools that have marked this an awareness of these things to provide us some documentation. So while there can be suspicions, it's our work at the office to try to identify and help us make a decision about the student's future eligibility, so that the documentation that a school might have can be provided with the concurrence form sent back to the school, or it could be sent directly to the IHSA office, or if not sent, expect to be to have the IHSA office reach out to you to ask for additional documentation or exactly what documentation you might have regarding that. Additionally, as we move on to the next section, which also has some questions relative to how the student may have transferred and if there's reservations about concurring with the transfer. As a sending school, when you send this back to the receiving school, there's no problem with also forwarding a copy of this concurrence form directly to the IHSA office to make us aware of your non-concurrence or possible awareness of some bylaw violations in conjunction with the transfer. So the more you can make the IHSA office aware of potential ineligibilities as a result of the transfer, schools, we welcome schools, sending schools in particular, to forward us that information, that it might help us follow up with the receiving school and maybe move quicker on resolving whether the student's going to be ineligible or eligible. Before we leave the concurrence form, also as a sending school, I would emphasize this point. First, your awareness that a student leaving your school that you know is an athlete, until you have the opportunity to complete this form as a sending school, you know that that student at the receiving school is not eligible until you've had a chance to complete this. So if you've not received it for a particular student that you know transferred away from your school and later find out that the school is competing, that's a time to communicate with our office, the IHSA office, to let us know that a student has left your school and you've yet to complete a concurrence form, whether or not the student would be rendered eligible or ineligible. This is a piece that is required in order for the student to compete. So as a sending school, you can help the IHSA office identify students that have transferred but may not have satisfied the requirements of the bylaw by having the principal's concurrence form completed. So please communicate with the IHSA office to let us know if you haven't had a chance to complete the concurrence form. That's the information we wanted to share. Updates related to the principal's concurrence form and some general guidelines about transfer eligibility. As always, the IHSA office, all administrators, including myself as the director who reviews the eligibility of transfer students, we're always available via email or via phone call to the office to answer any questions you might have about transfers or any other questions related to our eligibility bylaws. So we thank you for your time in reviewing this webinar. We hope you have found this helpful as you do the work within your schools, and we're hopeful that this will help get all of our schools in a position, in transfer students in particular, to have them eligible prior to their competing in competition. Again, thank you for your attendance and have a great rest of the school year.
Okay, we'll come back here. And a couple of questions came up at the very end of the presentation, and I'll respond to those. And if you have others, feel free to send them in during these next couple of moments. And then I think I've answered the questions except for these two that have come in. But if somebody asks a question during the presentation that I failed to answer, please let me know. Before I jump into these, I would point out that I have added the link to the PowerPoint. This link will take you to the PowerPoint of today's presentation without the audio. It's in the download section of our website. If you go to the download center and then look under documents and scroll down a little ways, you will see a heading for the new administrators workshop that our office conducted back about a month ago, and the third link under that heading says Transfer and Residence PowerPoint. If you click on that, take you to the presentation you just saw, but minus the audio, as I said a moment ago. Okay, a couple of questions to get to here. The first one that came in near the end asks, if sending school is aware the student is not living with the guardian, should they mark yes to question 29? Good question, and I would say yes. Question 29 says, are you aware of any IHSA bylaw that may result in a period of ineligibility for this student athlete? If yes, explain and attach available documentation. So yeah, I would recommend that you put yes as an answer to number 29. But I think there's also another question that you would want to mark no to. And I think that's question 24. Question 24 says, to your knowledge, is the information provided in section 1 true and correct? And I'm only suggesting you mark that no if the receiving school has said on part 1 of this form that the student is living with their parent or guardian. So if they say yes, because we asked that question, does the student reside full-time with parents, custodial parent, or court-appointed legal guardian? If the receiving school said yes, but you have information that leads you to believe that the student is not, you would want to mark for question 24, no, that to your knowledge, that's not correct. And then you could also mark in question 29 your answer of yes about the non-compliance with the IHSA bylaws that could lead to a period of ineligibility. The follow-up to that was, what if receiving school marked no? Well, then I think you would say, then I think you'd answer question 24 based on the information you have that, yeah, that information in part 1 is correct. And then you could still mark question 29 with an affirmative response because you believe the student's not living with their parent, custodial parent, or court-appointed legal guardian. So I think to answer the initial question that came in, yes, if you believe a student's not living with the person that they should be living with, you should mark yes, explain that. And then you may also have to answer 24 based on what you saw in section 1 from the receiving school. Okay, the other question that came in talks about section 2 of the form, the principal's concurrence form, question 21. And it says, if a parent contacts a private school with a transfer inquiry and the school replies to their inquiry, must the parents mark yes for this question, even if the parents initiate the contact? So question 21 says, I certify that I was not contacted or recruited by any agent of the receiving school, coach, or other representative with the express interest to obtain my attendance of the receiving school. So if a parent had called the school and spoken to an administrator, they could mark that question no. My only hesitation here is the intent of that. The intent of question 21 is to have the parent verify that they were not searched out or reached out by the school, by the receiving school. Certainly, if a parent initiates the call to the school, then that's a different story. And so I'm not even sure if you're trying to say, so let's say the parent tried the school, got into a voicemail, and the school called them back. Is that considered the school contacting? If you're wondering about that scenario, I would say no. Again, I would say that the point of question 21 is that a school representative began the contact with that student or with that family about possibly attending school there. So I'm just going to read this question one more time. I guess I would say the parents could mark no if they, meaning the parents, were the ones to begin that contact. And I guess I would say that with all of the information on the concurrence form, if there's something, let's just say using that last example with question 21, if somebody filled that out, I'm putting air quotes around this now, incorrectly and marked yes, there's going to be dialogue between our office and the school. And so just seeing a certain answer is not going to automatically make somebody ineligible. There's going to be some dialogue before a final decision is rendered by our executive director. So I hope that helps. I know that's a really long way to get to a short answer, and I apologize for that, but sometimes we take the road less traveled, I guess. I'm going to stick around for a few more minutes. We'll likely take one. We've done this presentation now 3 times in the last week. We'll likely be taking one of them and putting them in our archived areas, so that if you wanted to go back and listen to the audio again, you could. But like I said, you have the ability to access the presentation minus the audio if you so desire. Well, I want to thank everybody again for attending today's webinar. I think we've probably exhausted the questions that we have for today, but I would just remind anyone that if they come up with some questions later on, they could contact me, or really contact any of the administrative staff here at the office, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. We hope the rest of your school year goes well. Hope it's gotten off to a good start. We hope it continues to be that way. It doesn't seem possible, but we're in November. It'll be time for the holidays before we know it. So enjoy this time and enjoy the season ahead. And just hope that if there is ever any time when you need some assistance from our office, you'll feel comfortable in reaching out to us. Thanks again. Have a great day, and we'll see everyone down the line. We have one last question that's come in. I'm going to hold up here. Question would be saying that the submitter is reading question 21, that a parent would answer yes because they are confirming that a school did not contact them. Yes, and as I look at that now, I would agree with that. I think I was getting caught up in trying to just indicate that a school can respond to a parent's inquiry, and what that's just trying to, question 21 is just trying to verify that the initial contact wasn't made by the school. The initial contact came from the parent. So I agree with the last submitter's statement that 21 should be read as from a parent's perspective, that I wasn't contacted first. I was contacted. I was the one who did the contacting, or that nobody contacted me about the possibility of my son or daughter coming to this school. With those, with the new transfer forms, still a learning curve for everyone. So appreciate the good dialogue today, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see everyone out on the town meetings here in just a couple of weeks. Thanks again.